Hello and welcome to another Social Studies mini lesson. These are short lessons where we just look at one concept and the vocabulary that's associated with it. So today we're looking at the types of powers. This is specifically looking at the U.S. government. So in the U.S., we have federal government and then we have state governments, 50 different state governments. And there's kind of this continual tug of war between the two. Naturally, there are a lot of questions when you have different divisions of government. Should certain powers belong to the states or should they belong to the federal government? Exactly how much control should each side have? These are questions the U.S. Constitution had to answer. Otherwise, we would have devolved into chaos. So, the U.S. Constitution gives 4 types of powers to our government. Not 4 powers, 4 types of powers or categories of powers. These are enumerated powers, reserved powers, concurrent powers, and implied powers. So 4 different vocabulary terms that you should know. I'm going to go over these in just a minute. All right, so how do these powers look? What's the division of powers in the U.S.? Well, we've got our national government, right? And then we have our state governments. And so some powers are naturally going to belong to the national government. Others are going to belong to the state governments. And then out of necessity, you're going to have some overlap. So you've got enumerated powers, which belong to the national government or the federal government. Reserved powers belong to the state governments. Now you also have that overlap. Those are concurrent powers, powers that belong to both. And then you have your 4th type of power, implied powers, and those belong to the national government. All right, so you see how these break down? Now let's look at what they are specifically. We'll start with the enumerated powers. Now, these powers sometimes go by other names as well. Sometimes they're called delegated or even expressed powers. Those mean the same thing. So enumerated, delegated, expressed, same thing. Make sure you're familiar with all 3 terms. What the term means is powers that are specifically written down. And again, delegated, expressed, and enumerated, all 3 terms mean powers that are written down. Quite literally, in our Constitution, there's a list of these powers. They're granted to the federal government in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Among the list of powers, there are the powers to coin money, regulate commerce, declare war, raise and maintain armed forces, and establish a post office. And there's a bunch of other ones too. There's 27. Reserved powers. All right, reserved powers are specifically set aside for the states rather than the federal government. But unlike delegated powers or enumerated powers, they aren't listed specifically. It would frankly take too long to list them all. They are guaranteed by the 10th Amendment. Now, some examples of these: establishing and running public schools, passing the license requirements for professionals. Like, for example, there needs to be some sort of licensure for people that dispense medicine, pharmacists, because you don't want just anyone handling that. Otherwise, you could end up with some pretty bad interactions. So the state handles licensure. States license teachers. They license, most states, builders, because, you don't want just anyone slapping together a house. That could end pretty badly. Regulating alcohol, that's another thing that falls under the states. Where does state power come from? The 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Direct quote from the 10th Amendment. Concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are the powers that are shared by both the federal government and the state government. When you're building a government, you kind of want a little bit of overlap sometimes to make sure things don't fall through the cracks. So that's why we have concurrent powers. These powers can be exercised simultaneously within the same territory, in relation to the same body of citizens, and regarding the same subject matter. Because these powers are shared, sometimes federal and state governments get into disagreements about these powers. For example, there has been debate before over the issue of marriage. Every state sets its own marriage laws, but we have to have some kind of federal agreement about marriage, because otherwise two people could be married in one state, move to another, and they're no longer married according to that state. You can see how that would become pretty chaotic. So some examples of concurrent powers: taxing. You get taxed by both your state and your federal government. Borrowing money, states and the federal government both have the ability to do that. Regulation of elections. This has been rather contentious and in the news recently. Establishing courts, regulating commercial activity, claiming private property for public use. That's another controversial one. And then we've got the implied powers. Now, they're called implied because they're not written down. So these are also known as the inferred powers. Inferred, implied, same thing. They're not specifically stated in the Constitution, but they can be inferred from the elastic clause, or what's also known as the necessary and proper clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and other powers vested in the government of the United States. So it's a little bit wordy, but it's basically saying in order for Congress to carry out the powers that it has the right to make laws that are necessary for that. Now, because inferred or implied powers are not written down, sometimes they're controversial or they need to be discussed. So it often falls to the courts to decide what constitutes an implied power. And there is sometimes friction between the federal government and the state government over who should actually have these powers. Again, implied or inferred powers are not specifically listed in the Constitution. It's not like the enumerated powers where you literally have a list, but they grow out of the very existence of national government. For example, the U.S. has the power to acquire territory by exploration or by occupancy, basically because most governments claim that right. So some of the implied powers we have are there just because other national governments have been allowed to do this in the past. And so our government says, hey, if they can do that, so can we. So if you remember U.S. history, you might be familiar with the Louisiana Purchase, where Thomas Jefferson purchased a giant amount of territory, and he spent money to do that, federal money. And there was a question over, was this constitutional or not? Some people said no. The way he justified it was through the implied powers. The idea that the U.S. has the power as a federal government to acquire territory. So why do we have implied powers, you may be wondering? Well, Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. All comes down to Alexander Hamilton. And if you've seen the musical Hamilton, part of the musical actually covers the creation of this idea of implied powers. So some backstory. George Washington asked Alexander Hamilton to defend the constitutionality of having a national bank. The U.S. needed one, but was it actually constitutional to create one? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and several others were opposed to creating a national bank. So Hamilton's argument was, since the Constitution gives certain powers to the federal government, it also necessarily implies that the federal government has the right to use what means are necessary to exercise those powers. I mean, if you're going to do something, you have to have the implied ability to do that something, right? So, along with that, Hamilton further argued it would be impossible to foresee the future and the needs of the future, so it's impossible to write down every single possible power the government should have. You actually can't do an organized list because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. You don't know what technology is going to exist. You don't know what wars are going to happen, what the size of your country is going to be. I mean, think about it. When they're writing the Constitution, they don't have 50 states. They had no idea that there were going to one day be 50. So they had to figure out a workable framework that can also adjust to a growing and changing country. So implied powers kind of make sense. Now, how did Hamilton back up his argument with the Constitution? He cited the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause that we just looked at a second ago. And that's where implied powers come from. So to review, what are the 4 types of power granted by the Constitution? See if you can list them on your own. They are enumerated, reserved, concurrent, implied. Now, which of these powers belongs to the states, sets aside certain powers just for the states? If you said reserved powers, you are correct. Which of these 4 types of powers belong to both the federal and the state governments? Think for a sec. Concurrent. If you said concurrent, you were correct. Which powers belong to the federal or the national government? Enumerated and implied. Make sure you remember both. Those are both federal government. All right, I hope this lesson was helpful.